Yeah, that's fascinating. It's such an interesting topic, and you do see a lot of people in our community who are, in my opinion, and probably yours as well, way over consuming things like organ meats. And they seem to have issues where other people who, kind of like yourself, have been in this community for so long, just don't really seem to have a problem when they're just consuming regular meat that they get at the store. And it doesn't really seem to be a problem with that. You mentioned something interesting about bringing in carbohydrates and helping the issue by doing that. It seems like, I don't know, do you find that people who are very strict on a carnivore diet could be benefited by like intermittently bringing in some carbohydrates some of the time? It doesn't sound like the effects are that great. Like, I know for me, when I bring them in, I experience my anxiety comes back, my sleep kind of sucks, I have cravings again. It lasts for like a day and a half. It's not the worst, it's not the best, so I don't choose to do it very often. But you also hear about other benefits of doing it periodically. Do you think the exchange is worth it for most people who are doing mostly a carnivore diet?
I think mostly not, actually. I think if you have some specific thing going on and the carnivore diet isn't feeling amazing to you, there may be more of a reasoning for trying something like that and a potential for getting a benefit somehow. But for someone who's just coasting along, doing awesome on a carnivore diet, like it sounds like you are, and like I have experienced in the past, I see only downsides to doing that. Like you said, like getting cravings, disrupting things. Um, you can you can always get a kind of more glucose-based metabolism burst by doing higher protein and sort of I know some people who alternate, for example, between higher protein phases and lower protein, higher fat phases and seem to get benefit. And so maybe that does argue for a benefit of doing a more cyclical type of diet. And certainly, I think that there are kinds of carbohydrates that are less harmful to people than others. Um, and I would, at least in my personal experiences, seem to show that starches in particular that are very like white, having very few other bioactive chemicals in them, seem to be particularly safe. I can't believe I'm saying this because I was so against the safe starch movement many years ago. Paul Gem and I used to talk about safe starches, and rice was the one that he was particularly in favor of. Um, but I would really hesitate to say that it's the kind of thing that would be necessary for sustaining a carnivore diet, just because I know so many people who have needed no such intervention, and I don't really see any logical reason for it either.
Gotcha. That's fascinating. You mentioned the fat and protein, and I consider you one of the absolute experts in helping us understand how much fat to protein we need as far as a ratio goes. I'm wondering how your thinking around that has evolved over time and how you're currently thinking about how much fat, how much protein, and how we decide when we're out of balance and what we need to add in or subtract.
Oh, that's a good way of phrasing it. I mean, the original carnivore diet uh, that I was doing and that the people I was with were doing was not macro based, really. What we would find, we would tell people to eat fatty meat, but in practice, that would often look like something like around 70% fat and 30% protein. And I think 30% protein is about as high as you start to get before it becomes too much, if you're eating enough, that is. Um, and I was really compelled by how many people were getting such incredible benefits, and almost all of us had come from a low carb diet already. So it's not like we went from a sad diet to a carnivore diet and started getting all these benefits. So I was surprised because the low carb diet seemed to be getting its benefits from being particularly ketogenic, and moving to a diet of only meat, where the proportion was very often a lot higher. Like you imagine somebody who's on a low carb diet and they're eating a lot of, say, salad and oil or avocados or foods that are higher fat than they are protein, and a lot of fiber. And so it tends to be more ketogenic. And then they move to a carnivore diet, which is only mildly ketogenic if you're doing it at that level of protein. And yet people were still getting immense benefits. And so for a long time, I thought, wow, the ketosis piece is important. I know it is, but it's not the only thing that's important. And maybe it's not even the most important thing about a carnivore diet, because people are being less ketogenic and yet they're getting more benefits. But then the longer I was in that community, the more I found that there were some people who would not get that same level of benefit unless they were much more careful about their macronutrients. And so then, as you know, I started doing more of a deep dive into what happens if you restrict your food choices in the same way that a carnivore diet does, but you do pay attention to this macronutrient level, and you reduce your protein and add fat. And it's not even about ad libitum eating, because at first I thought, well, when you eat ad libitum, you're just naturally going to eat a lot more protein. And I think if you try to make the ratio be like 2 to 1, for example, fat to protein, and you just eat as much meat as you want and then add fat on top, it's always going to feel like a struggle. But if you start, and Siobhan Huggins did a really great post on this, fat first eating. If you start with eating something that's almost pure fat, or that's already at a 2 to 1 ratio, you start naturally getting satiation and satiety with a lower level of protein. And so that can also start to lock in, sort of in the same way that when you start a low carb diet, you might initially have to consciously not eat more carbohydrates, but once you've got your new metabolic state going, you no longer crave the carbohydrates. And in a similar way, I've noticed that people who try this higher fat, lower protein approach, at first it may be difficult and you want more protein, but then it sets itself up in its own metabolic state. And that seems to have worked a lot for people, especially who have a protein sensitivity for some reason or other. Sometimes it's from a diabetic history, and I don't even know what all the reasons are. And so how you know to adjust, I think a lot of it can be done intuitively. I know even when I was straight up carnivore and not trying to lower protein, I would still go through phases where, wow, I really want the fattiest ribeye that I can find in the store. And I'm going to eat my portion, and I'm going to eat half of my husband's portion before I'm going to be satiated at that meal. And then sometimes I would just have phases where I just really want the leaner piece and I don't want as much. And I learned to just put trust into my intuitions about that, and that mostly served me very, very well.
Yeah, interesting. I wouldn't be too happy if I was your husband and you were eating my portion of steak, though. I just have to say I'd be pretty pissed off about that. Well, that's really interesting, and I think I'm kind of with you as far as like the best way to answer that question. Like fat to protein, how do you know? Honestly, I do think it's the intuition. Like I always keep on hand ribeyes, and I also keep on hand New Yorks. And the New Yorks that I get are a little bit leaner, and you can kind of cut the fat cap off if you want. And I never really know, like going into the afternoon, what I'm going to want. But inevitably, I get to the afternoon and decide, like, oh, this one looks really good. That one doesn't look as good. The next day, it might be completely backwards. And, some days I'll cook it in butter. And other days, I don't want to cook it in butter. I just want it straight up. And so, do you find that as long as you're setting fences around what you consider food and it's mostly carnivore, that that is the best way to be intuitive about your eating and just decide what sounds the best and let your body kind of dictate the level of fat or protein that you need that day?
I think that's absolutely the best way to approach it, unless you're trying to move to the more ketogenic version, in which case, like I said, you might need a few days to adjust to the lower protein intake before it starts to feel natural to you.
Yeah, gotcha. How bad does that answer suck for somebody like you who's so scientifically minded and is an expert in mathematics and computer science to have to say at the end of the day, we don't know, you have to be intuitive about it? Is that hard to come to that conclusion?
Well, it's quite a relief. I mean, I would like to free up as much bandwidth for thinking and planning for other things in my life. And when things just work out, and when when I don't have to use my prefrontal cortex to figure out what to eat, it's actually quite liberating.
That's a good point. I love that.